During the early years of the New Deal, the federal government established the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation actually went out in Brooklyn and they began mapping out the borough into 66 neighborhoods, going block by block and finding every Black, Latino, Irish, Jewish, Italian, Polish family that was there, and assigning ratings to each neighborhood based on the racial and ethnic makeup. Then they distributed the maps to banks and held banks to a certain standard when loaning money for homes and rental. The consequences of having your ratings go down is, of course, that your housing property goes down. So, for instance, white Brooklynites living in the old sections of North Brooklyn all of a sudden find out that their housing is less valuable, not because they've done anything and not because their neighborhood has changed, but because banks won't lend anyone money to move there unless those people are Black. After the Homeowners Loan Corporation begins segregating on the federal level and working with local banks in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx, and Queens, the state gets involved in redlining. They also map out Brooklyn. They go block by block, and this time they look for only Black and Latino persons, and a single Black person living on a block is enough to redline a block. The effect will be, in fact, to do extraordinary damage to Black communities throughout New York. All of a sudden, Black communities that had been scattered throughout New York City, which had long traditions in certain neighborhoods in the southern part of New York, throughout Brooklyn and Queens, and even on Staten Island, were being physically segregated, rooted up. When the Homeowners Loan Corporation finishes its work in the 1940s, it has dramatically altered the makeup of Brooklyn. In 1930, when the Depression starts, Black Brooklynites are actually the least segregated group physically in the borough. By 1950, they're the most segregated group. The segregation is all in central Brooklyn in the Bedford-Stuyvesant district, and that will become the largest Black ghetto in the United States by the end of the 1960s. In the 1930s, Harlem goes from being an ethnic community with quite a bit of mobility and optimism to a racial slum with very little optimism, very little hope. The federal government had armed banks and insurance companies and real estate dealers with the public authority to keep Black people inside that physical space and to force new Black migrants to the city inside similar physical spaces. So that as Harlem expands in the 1930s and 1940s, as Bedford-Stuyvesant expands in the 40s and 50s, what remains true about them is Black communities no longer control their own destiny. By the 50s and 60s, they're being forced and physically quarantined inside the city at a time when white Americans are peculiarly mobile. Why is there a Black ghetto in every city in the United States? The answer is public policy, the way we remap cities racially in order to solve economic crises.